Take a look at this thing called a forest plot. It's a shortcut to finding the science that helps you ride faster. It does this by combining the results of multiple scientific studies that tackle the same question. In this case, it shows the effect size of training below and training above threshold on time trial performance. And well, as you can see by this thing here, in these 5 studies, there was no difference. Simply put, time trial performance is no different whether training includes above threshold work or not. That's wild. And frankly, I'm very surprised by this finding because we've been told for years that in already trained cyclists, further improvements in performance can only be achieved through high-intensity interval training. But this systematic review and meta-analysis from 2023 examined the impact of adding high-intensity interval training, HIIT, to low-intensity interval training, LIT, in people who are already trained. They looked at 14 studies with 299 total subjects, including well-known papers from, say, Stephen Seiler, Paul Larson, David Bishop, John Hawley, and others. And they were also expecting to find that high-intensity interval training, HIIT, above threshold improves time trial performance more than just riding low-intensity training under threshold. But no. In fact, what they found was even more surprising because in their abstract, they went on to say this: no intensity-specific effect was observed for peak watts or time trial performance. But that's not the most interesting part because they found an improvement in VO2 peak. So 2 to 12 weeks of training with intensity above threshold improved VO2 peak more than only training below. And by a big margin as well, actually. Around 2.5 milliliters per kilogram per minute in already trained athletes. This might represent 3 to 6% of an improvement in aerobic capacity. How confident can we be in these findings? But let's say we take the findings at face value. This still leaves us with a big problem. Namely, what HIIT sessions lead to real-world performance gains? Like, is there really an optimal type of high-intensity training for endurance performance? And I'll warn you, the answer's probably going to disappoint you. To help us answer these questions, we need to first understand the idea of accumulated training time at or near VO2 max. Since the inception of high-intensity interval training, HIIT, as a scientific study, there has been an interest among the sports science community in finding training protocols that enable athletes to sustain the longest time above 90% of their maximum oxygen consumption, VO2 max. And maybe this measure follows Goodhart's law. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. Because there are still no clear guidelines on how high-intensity interval training protocols that improve real-world performance exist. In fact, as late as September 2023, a review by some heavy hitters in the exercise physiology world wrote this about HIIT for performance endurance. The optimal type of HIIT to enhance endurance performance in highly trained athletes who have little room for additional physiological improvement is still unclear. This article is just one of many with a similar position over the past few decades. It's important to understand why this caught on and what this means for your high-intensity training. And it all started here, in this nondescript building in 1960 at the Royal Gymnastic Central Institute, now the Swedish School of Sport and Health Sciences, where Astrod et al. And Christensen et al. Published several classic papers on the acute physiological responses to HIIT, which are credited as the first scientific basis for long and short duration intervals. It's also here where they state that 90 to 100% of VO2 max intensity is the most effective in producing improvements. Here we have Per Olof Östrand on the right and another author, Ben Sultan, on a similar bike erg that was used in some of the studies, and it's handy to know in the Östrand et al., only the same physically well-trained male subject in each of their papers, RH, a 25-year-old, who was also in Christensen's intervention, but somehow he's 4 years older and 2 kilograms lighter. But there is also another male subject, BS, a 24-year-old with a VO2 max of 68. And according to Boucher and Larson in their 2013 paper, the important responses and mechanisms of HIIT had already been demonstrated by these researchers. And Most of the scientific work that followed these studies over the past 20 to 50 years has been an extension of these findings using new technology in the field. This is more accurate and portable devices. Now, if we skip forward 26 years to 1986, a review by Wegner and Bell of 59 training studies conducted over this period showed that the 90 to 100% of VO2 max intensity is the most effective in producing improvements. And as a comparison to other intensities, they grouped 4 intensity levels and their effect on training. And as you can see here, it clearly shows that the 90 to 100% of VO2 max has a larger effect, to which they concluded that intensity seems to be the key factor in producing improvements, since increasing intensity up to 100% of VO2 max produces the greatest improvements. The only problem is the studies used to build this figure is based on untrained subjects. For example, Thomas et al. In 1984 used untrained men and women, and in 1985 they used male college students. But the quest to find the optimal type of high-intensity training continues, and a landmark study by Billet et al. In 2000, working with 8 trained runners with a mean VO2 max of 59.8, the authors demonstrated that 30-second intervals performed until exhaustion at the minimal velocity to elicit VO2 max with 30 seconds of active recovery at 50% of VO2 max accumulated more than double the time spent at VO2 max when compared to continuous running to exhaustion above critical speed in trained runners. But we don't have any clear performance measures that come out of this study. And there's even more sad face when even 46 years after the initial findings in 2006, a review by Midgley et al. Concluded that even though several studies have demonstrated that VO2 max of well-trained runners can be enhanced when training protocols are known to elicit 95 to 100% of VO2 max, however, there have been no well-controlled studies that support this premise. Man, this science stuff is really taking its time. Up until this point, there is limited evidence regarding which training intensity is the most effective. But in 2015, 55 years after the initial studies, we have a first, an intervention study by Turns et al. That supports previous studies that have theoretically suggested that more time spent or near VO2 max is an important stimulus to improve VO2 max in well-trained athletes. The details of this intervention are on the screen right now, and you can pause if you want to take a longer look. And I have to admit, I was pretty excited at this point until I saw the details of the subjects, because they are 19 to 26-year-old male recreational cyclists with VO2 maxes under 50 milliliters per kilogram per minute. And another blow was the authors concluding that even with this finding, there is no correlation between VO2 max improvement from higher times at VO2 max. And to be fair, I was probably crying by this point until I came across this. I seem to have found the mother of all high-intensity interval training intervention for time trial performance forest plots. To be fair, it's probably the only one that exists. But yeah, I was excited. And here's why. The 2021 systematic review and meta-analysis included trained athletes riding bikes, and there were other modalities, rowing and running. But let's have a look at a cycling study. And how about this one here? As for results, the HIIT group had a faster post-intervention mountain bike race performance, and to be fair, they found out that both sprint interval training, anaerobic and high-intensity aerobic training led to improvements in lactate threshold and the onset of blood lactate accumulation. It is something, though. We are getting somewhere. But in all honesty, at this point, I just gave up. Well, I ran out of papers, so I revisited the 2023 opinion article to summarize what's happened since 2015, and it won't surprise you to know that accumulated time at or above 90% of VO2 max continued to be the aim of many of the HIIT protocols, but examined in many different ways. And I'm just reading straight from the Coates et al. Article here when I say,
other studies have since examined variations of interval length, intensities, work to rest ratios, and pacing strategies to optimize the accumulated time equal to or greater than 90% of VO2 max. However, these investigations were rarely performed in highly trained or elite athletes.
I have to make another note of Ben Ronenstad's work. And there is a line that can be drawn directly from the 1960 studies right through to Rozenek et al. That found that a 2-to-1 ratio of work to recovery resulted in a greater percentage of VO2 max than 1-to-1 or 4-to-1 ratios, and now Ronstadt et al. Demonstrating good results with 2-to-1 ratios in cyclists. But not surprisingly, ever since 2015, research papers by Ronstadt et al. Reintroduced the high-volume repeated short interval training to a new generation of cyclists, and his work has sparked a lot of debate. In 2020, Ronstadt et al. Demonstrated that when training programs were matched for total volume and intensity, 3 weeks of repeated sprint interval sessions, 3 sets of 13 times 30 seconds intervals at maximal sustainable intensity with 15 seconds recovery and 3 minutes between sets, improved VO2 max, maximal aerobic power, and 20-minute cycling power in elite male cyclists. And this type of interval does show some promise, as it shows real-world gains in highly trained athletes. In conclusion, if there is a conclusion here, the answer to the original questions of what HIIT sessions lead to real-world performance gains and is there really an optimal type of high-intensity training for endurance performance? Well, none and no. It's now, 63 years after the first study, and the evidence that more duration near VO2 max is effective training is relatively weak. And I searched high and low, but I am just not aware of any studies showing well-trained or even just trained cyclists that train at or above 90% of VO2 max 1, 2, or 3 times a week, and it increases some type of performance measure, VO2, critical power, time trial. Perhaps it would be more beneficial to build upon existing research and focus on measuring real performance. It is critical to recognize the importance of this work though, and for you personally to avoid pushing yourself to the maximum every time you engage in physical activity, as it can lead to burnout. And the purpose of these studies, I know, is to determine the most effective method of stimulating improvements in the body within the limitations of prolonged training periods without negatively affecting performance. All right, so where does this leave us? We still got to train, right? Yes, we do.